Lu, and I would like to, on behalf of the Friends of Multilateralism Group, and also on behalf of WEF, World Economic Forum, ADT, to welcome you to our joint event on industrial subsidies. And this is such an important subject, and we have such a good panel. So I won't be long. I will just announce a few logistic issues, and then we go right ahead to rock and roll. The first thing is that probably for those of you who are not probably aware yet, this meeting is going to be recorded and shared on FMG YouTube afterwards. So please be mindful. Of course, we are still restricted group here, so we want to still have a dynamic and candid discussion. The second thing, one of our speakers, Bernard, is going to be late for a few minutes, but he will join us soon, so don't worry. And also for those who are not speaking, I ask you to kindly turn off your microphone so that we could have a very good silent, not silent, but a good environment for discussion. So with that, I will just go ahead and give the floor to Julia. Thank you very much, Julia. Please.
Thanks very much, Lewin. And good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, depending which time zones you're in. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is an issue which we at the OECD and I personally have spent a lot of time thinking about. So it's a real treat to be having such an interesting panel today. We have three wonderful speakers and we have two equally wonderful discussants. But I notice also have a terrific audience of people who also know a lot about this. So each of the speakers has 10 minutes, and I would urge and encourage them to stick as closely as possible to that time so that we can indeed benefit not just from all of the speakers, but also benefit from the audience that we have as well. So I'm not going to do long introductions because there are many interesting things to talk about. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to our first speaker, who is Kamala Dawar, and she's a senior lecturer in commercial law at the University of Sussex. Kamala, over to you.
Thank you very much, Julia, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak. And really what I want to do is present the report that I've been working on with a DT and economist, Eyal Ronen. And we've done this as a kind of stakeholder exercise. So as I said before the audience turned up, it's not easy getting consensus, even amongst people who have consensus that multilateralism is a good thing. So what the objective of the report really was to talk beyond this group of enlightened thinkers and to try and make something that was accessible to the audience that actually really needs to know what's going on and why it's relevant. Trade has been so politicized, but I think the fundamental essence of what trade is supposed to do is getting lost in that. And coming from a consumer perspective, that's not a good thing. So we wanted to present something that really showed the new landscape, what's changed since the sort of the formation of the GATT, rolling into the WTO, and how these changes have really sort of threatened the fabric of what's been created so far. And what we should do about that, and how we should sort of recognize that 20th century oil age rules they're not fit for purpose for the 21st century in our new landscape. So what we tried to do was kind of separate out the different interventionist measures that we thought that were the most sort of relevant for the moment, and they were sort of export subsidies, procurement and localization, FDI screening, state-owned enterprises, the control and behavior of them, and remedies. So it covers quite a lot, and I'm not going to go into the detail of it now, but what we really wanted to do was set out the state of debate, the areas of contention, the ideas that are being floated by different parties and different actors, and then come up with some ways forward. And of course, ways forward is very much like a wish list at the moment, but really it starts with transparency. And I know if Bernard was here, he would fully concur with that. And it's about sort of incentivizing both transparency and notification, filling those gaps. Particularly, we know that the subsidies agreement is really not able at the moment. There's no consensus on what it can address, and the center is falling apart. And one approach to this could be open plurilateral agreements, or sort of coming up with new incentives to create coordination, cross-border coordination. I think what the fundamental question for me is really, we're in a situation where we can carry on tinkering with the rules at the fringes, which is what we've been doing, and it hasn't been particularly successful, but it's preferable to overhauling those rules, because the likelihood is if we try and overhaul radically those rules, we'll end up with complete decoupling of the trading system. And decoupling of the trading system is where it seems to be going, and that's not a good thing for businesses. It's not a good thing for consumers. So we are in a situation where we're trying to kind of like patch up with a Band-Aid rather than actually sort of solve the problems. And just to give an example before I pass over to my colleagues, just to give an example of how this is becoming very confusing. My area of interest at the moment is export credit subsidies, export credit agencies, the work they're doing, and how we have this kind of like decoupled system. We have the OECD arrangement, and then we have a lot of actors who are very significant: China, India, South Africa. They're growing. Saudi Arabia's got an ECA outside of this arrangement, and it's invitation only. So it's not an open plurilateral system, and maybe that invitation only thing should be looked at. This example I wanted to give you is that, you know, we know there's a big problem with export credits, the lack of transparency, the unknown effect of the supply chains and spillovers, and also cross-border subsidization. Negotiations going on since 2012 in the International Working Group on Export Credit Agencies. That included China, that included America, the OECD players, big players. The OECD members largely just walked away from that last summer. And their argument was that China was not playing ball. Now, what we've had this movement now is that the OECD has come out with a new arrangement on export credits, on the prohibiting the abatement, export subsidies and credit arrangements to unabated coal-powered plants. This sounds great, but it increases that kind of decoupling. And also it just largely builds on what the G7 announced earlier. So really, we don't see much shift, but we do see some kind of like, tinkering that doesn't really do anything substantive. And I wonder, really for my colleagues, if they think this tinkering and Band-Aid approach is the only way forward, given the current international landscape and the political economy, or whether we should be thinking outside of just open plurilateralisms and kind of soft coordination through RTAs. And maybe there is something more fundamental to be done here that could incentivize all parties. So I just want to leave that there. And of course, I really encourage you to take some time and read the report when it's published, because we've tried to kind of reflect the state of debate among those who actually do believe that the multilateral system is fundamentally the best and most enlightened way forward.
Thanks very much, Kamala. And I think your point, your opening point is a very good one, that trade gets very politicized, and sometimes we lose track of the benefits, we lose track of what's at stake, and there's a need to actually bring some evidence in there to correct. Maybe just a little point of information. So not so much a new arrangement on export credits that was agreed last week, but some of the participants to the existing arrangement agreed on an additional discipline under which they would, as Kamala mentioned, not support unabated coal projects. So this was actually hard fought to bring on board the non-G7 members of the arrangement, but which it did. There are also separate discussions that are due to start on modernising the arrangement more generally in order to respond to big changes in the market, and also some of the practices which are currently not covered by the arrangement. Invitation is an open invitation. Whether everyone's interested in coming, I'm less sure. Let me turn next to the next speaker, which is Jean Heilman Grier, and she's the trade principal at Djaghe LLC. Jean, can I turn to you?
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion or join this discussion today. I'm going to address 3 points related to government procurement. One, the limitations on the growth of the WTO procurement agreement. Two, the challenge of addressing SOEs under the agreement. And three, the need for multilateral rules on transparency in government procurement. Government procurement generally accounts for 10 to 15% of GDP. It's 12% among the OECD countries. But despite its significance, it is not subject to any multilateral rules. It's only a plurilateral agreement that has just celebrated its 40th anniversary. That agreement, the WTO Government Procurement Agreement, GPA, covers 48 WTO members, which is less than 1/3 of the WTO membership. Its growth has been slow. In the past 25 years, it added 25 members, and most of those came in through, or the majority came in through the growth, or through the EU enlargement. It now covers all developed countries and a few developing countries. So its future growth rests upon persuading developing countries to join the agreement. And the most likely source of new GPA parties, based upon the past experience, are developing countries that join the WTO and in their WTO negotiation accession, or their WTO accession negotiations, are persuaded to take what I would call the GPA pledge, that is, to seek GPA membership once they become WTO members. 24 of the 36 countries that have joined the WTO have made that pledge. Most are in some process or have either completed it or are in the process of doing so. A few have not yet started. This number includes 6 of the 7 countries currently negotiating GPA accession. They all have taken the GPA pledge, and that includes China and Russia. The challenge of the GPA is how to bring in the 90 or so WTO members who transitioned from the GATT and have not taken any steps to become GPA parties. They have generally shown little, if any, interest in GPA membership, even though many have taken on government procurement obligations in a variety of regional trade agreements. Brazil is the only country currently negotiating to join the GPA that does not have that. I'm getting feedback. Maybe it's okay. A second issue is illustrated by China's negotiations to join the GPA. Those negotiations are now in their 14th year, and they do not appear to be close to closure. China has made great strides in aligning its proposed coverage, the procurement that it would bring under the agreement. It's been made great strides in aligning that procurement with the GPA parties coverage, but its coverage of SOEs remains a major stumbling block. Currently, and to date, it has only offered 20 SOEs, and most of those are at the local or provincial level. The GPA has no rules or guidelines on SOE coverage. The scope of that coverage is based upon negotiations between the acceding country and the GPA parties, based upon the principle of strict reciprocity. Before turning to my final point, I want to touch on the ongoing challenge of buy local and domestic content requirements. And there, the US continues to lead the way, and not necessarily in the best way. But Buy American rules illustrate the value of transparency in procurement. We may not like the Buy American rules or the Buy Local rules, but in the case of the US, we know what they are and how they are applied. And that's not the case in many countries. So the WTO should consider reviving the efforts abandoned in the early 2000s to negotiate a multilateral agreement on government procurement, on transparency in government procurement, and one that would be only limited to transparency and not move into market access discussions. In the early 2000s, transparency in government procurement was one of the so-called Singapore issues. But moving forward with that, that agreement was rejected at the Cancun Ministerial. But a common set of transparency requirements that would apply to all members would first emphasize the importance of government procurement as a component of the trade arena. It would also facilitate members in participating in cross-border procurement. And the rules would be predictable, even if they were subject to buy local requirements. It would ensure that suppliers could go from one country to another and know what the rules were because they would be all under a common principle. More and more countries are embracing transparency requirements in their regional trade agreements and just even in their own practices. For example, the 15-country RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in Asia, added a procurement chapter sort of late in their negotiations. It's limited to transparency, but it's at least there and something to build on. The expanding use of e-procurement by countries throughout the world would make it easier for countries to embrace a common set of transparency rules. And such rules could also be used to tackle corruption and also to support good governance. So it's time to consider bringing government procurement rules, it's time to consider bringing government procurement under multilateral transparency rules and not just leaving it as a niche agreement sort of on the margins of the WTO. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. And I think we've been setting up the debate very usefully so far. I think Kamala's paper, and for those of you who haven't read it, I strongly encourage you to do, on industrial policy and international competition, trade and investment perspectives, I think provides a useful set out of the landscape across subsidies, SOEs, government procurement and investment screening. And I think Jean has just given us a very good case for why we should be thinking about government procurement and also especially the buy local industry in there. So we have a sort of continuum of measures. We have a continuum of transparency ways forward. We have a continuum of levels of transparency in the current situation. And perhaps that's a good moment to turn to our final speaker, which is Simon Evenett, who's the Professor of International Trade and Economic Development at the University of St. Gallen. Simon, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to present the 28th Global Trade Alert Report, which I co-authored with Johannes Fritz. This report looks at the scale of subsidies which have been awarded by China, the United States, and the European Union since the global financial crisis. We decided to take a look at this question again because a lot of the recriminations in the last few years have centered on non-market practices, including those of subsidies. We note that there's been a lot of excellent economic and as well as legal analysis, but we felt that the underlying factual basis for these discussions could be potentially strengthened. And with that in mind, we set about trying to assemble an inventory of the subsidy awards and subsidy policy changes by the three big trading powers. We do not claim to have captured every single subsidy, but we do claim that the inventory that we've made public is probably the largest that's available. And that information is, of course, available to any government and any analyst who wants to look into it. Now, in assembling this particular subsidy inventory, we exploited the factual, the data sources at the national level. Many countries provide information on subsidy schemes, on subsidy recipients, and they also often mandate that subsidy receipt by publicly listed companies has to be declared as well. And we took advantage of all of those different sources to put together an inventory of 18,137 subsidies, awards, and schemes by these three powers. 0.3% of those awards were documented using non-official sources. So this is very much a heavily publicly documented inventory. We did not use the WTO notifications which countries made on subsidies. These have become, unfortunately, contested, and we wondered if that was not necessarily the right way to go. Each of the three trading powers contributed over 5,000 subsidy awards and policy changes into this inventory, so each was quite heavily represented, and just under 1.05% of the subsidy policy changes that we saw were cases where subsidies were either eliminated or reduced. So that indicates the direction of change for most of the subsidies that we've seen over the last 10 years. We have, just introducing on the notion of a subsidy here, we used a very conventional state aid or competition law perspective. That is the notion of a subsidy by a public body involving the transfer of state resources. And this was a very conventional approach, which we've described at length in the report. In terms of the findings that we have, there are essentially 6. The first is that the subsidy inventory or subsidies have been unfolding well before COVID hit. So the huge number of subsidies that we found are not a COVID-related phenomenon. Secondly, the subsidies that we found are not related to any one country or any one economic development model. Third, that subsidies are not just confined to agriculture, which has been a traditional area of contention. Fourth, that subsidies are not just awarded by central governments. And so any comprehensive attempt to talk about subsidies probably needs to talk about subnational governments, states and cities, as well as supranational bodies like the European Investment Bank. We also find the fifth finding is that subsidies towards commerce abroad, so either exports or financing the overseas operations of companies, are very prevalent as well. So we should not just be focusing on the effects of subsidies on market access in the countries implementing those subsidies. And sixth, the amount of trade covered by these subsidies is estimated using standard conservative methods to be significant. We estimate that the 3 trading powers we discussed, the trade in trading goods where there is a subsidized competitor from these 3 jurisdictions, this amounts to about 62% of global goods trade before the pandemic hits. So the pandemic adds on top of all of this. So there's a sizable amount of global trade which is at stake, a sizable amount of market access at stake. I should add, and I really want to stress this, that although the focus of our study is on the United States, the European Union, and China, other countries have also used subsidies, and we have documented a lot of those independently in our work. Another almost 6,000 subsidies we've documented from other countries. If you add in those other countries' subsidies, then the share of global goods trade, which is covered by subsidies in 2019, was just over 80%. So this is an 80% problem. Now, of course, that's a statement of the scale of the problem, not necessarily of the effects, and I will come back to that. So overall then, what we, I think, have established is even though we know we haven't covered, we probably have missed some subsidies, and there are probably some hidden subsidies out there, the scale of what we have been able to document is significant, and this merits further consideration by governments and by analysts. And so with that in mind, we recommend that going forward, there should be an informal, evidence-based, technocratic policy dialogue on subsidies. And this should start after MC12, well into next year. I don't think it necessarily has to be part of any work program. Let's not gum up the MC12 machine anymore. But after we've got through MC12, maybe we should have a period of reflection about subsidies and their role in the trading system. And we could focus then on the following factors. We need to scale the size of subsidies and get a much better sense of the effects. Now, clearly here, we do have great work we've had from the OECD over the years on the effects of agricultural subsidies. And it would be great to be able to expand that to the service sectors and also to trading goods. Secondly, we need to revisit where the logic for subsidy policy interventions in the first place. Where are subsidy policy interventions strictly necessary, or where are other policy interventions better? And can we differentiate among different types of subsidy policy interventions for ones which are less trade distortive? The third thing we need to do is to evaluate the rationales, different rationales for multilateral rules on or multilateral cooperation on subsidies. We outline the current thinking on this by different analysts in the report. It's very important to stress that no one is talking about abolishing or getting rid of subsidies. Everyone recognizes that governments are going to want to use subsidies. The question then is what guiding logic should structure cooperation in this area? What makes sense and what is likely to command a support? The fourth thing we need to look at is whether there are any complementarities between between further cooperation on subsidies and other compelling social imperatives like reducing fossil fuel subsidies. There may be some useful complementarities that can be exploited and would support reforms in national economies. Fifthly, we need to revisit how we gather information on subsidies and whether subsidies can be made more transparent, especially in light of the fact that so many governments make subsidy information available at the national level. And you might be surprised how many governments actually do this. And it's not just a characteristic of democracies which do this. And the sixth thing we need to do is reflect on, in light of all of the information that I just described, what future plan there could be for greater cooperation on subsidies, perhaps between subsets of the WTO membership. Thank you very much, Julia.
Thank you, Simon. And I think I would encourage people to have a look at the report. It's very interesting. Certainly, I think from the work that we've done over the years at the OECD on ag and fish and fossil fuels and on industrials, you know, we see the same thing. It's widespread across sectors, it's subnational, and certainly this is one of those things that everyone's at it. The other thing that always strikes me is the endless creativity, the boundless creativity of governments when it comes to providing subsidies and support. And I think that the emphasis that we've seen today on the newness is also a big issue. And certainly the what to do about it and how do we get the technocratic evidence together, and then how do we marry that with the politics of getting reform? And I'm hoping that perhaps our two discussants can help shed some light on this as well. So let me turn to the first discussant, who needs no introduction, but I'll give one anyway, Bernard Hoekman, who's the Professor and Director of Global Economics at the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies in the European University Institute. Bernard, pleasure to see you. Over to you.
Great, thanks. Glad to be with you all, and apologies for being late. But as I think Simon might have mentioned, we were double booked, so I decided to stick around a bit longer in the previous webinar. So I'm going to speak to both papers. And there's clearly a link between them. So I think let me start with the paper by Kamala and her co-author, whose name I unfortunately forget. So I think all of this, the items that are highlighted are obviously big ticket items in terms of things that are raising trade tensions. What I find, what I think, and this is obviously not an analytical paper and it's not intended to be, but I think insofar as giving messages to governments in terms of where to go, so we have these areas of debate that are highlighted in the paper on the various issue areas and then what to do. I think there needs to be much more focus on analysis, right? So I think we're taking too much as given that this is all out there. There's complaints, governments are focusing on this, but what we really need to be telling governments, in my view, is focus on things that really matter. In terms of welfare, in terms of the trading system, in terms of distortions. And I think the message here is we simply don't know enough, right? So a lot of things are being alleged as being a big problem. I think state-owned enterprises is a good example. But how much evidence do we actually have? And what are the real issues? Does it really make sense to say, okay, we continue on the commercial considerations, et cetera, front, without really having done our homework, I would argue, in terms of, okay, so what actually matters from the perspective of competitive spillovers, the incidence of those effects, who is gaining, who is losing, on the one hand, on the other hand, type analysis, of course, which nobody really likes, but I think we have to do it. And I think we need to tell governments that more of that needs to be done, even for just credibility, for accountability in terms of, okay, we're saying we need to do these things, but how is it actually going to benefit people, right? So again, and if we don't know what the competitive distortions are, what the costs are, it's also going to be very difficult to say, okay, this is how it's actually going to improve things. And here are the people, and whether they're consumers, producers, who are going to benefit from doing so. So that's really my first point. We need to really, I would argue, emphasize the need for more analysis. On the procurement section, one of the things that occurred to me when I was reading it, why the focus on SOEs again? Is it simply because that's a politically salient entry point at the moment? Because if I step back and I think about government procurement, for me, the big question really is, why are so few countries signing on to these types of agreements, right? So we're pretty much stuck with the same countries we had 30 years ago when they joined the government procurement agreement. Now, clearly, that has a lot to do with industrial policy, I would argue. Clearly, procurement is for many governments the kind of easiest way of doing industrial policy in quotes. But then, okay, so I would kind of put more attention on that particular area and say, okay, what do we actually know about good procurement policy, and how is it consistent or inconsistent with actually pursuit of industrial policy objectives? Again, so that was kind of more of a question I had, and I think it's an illustration of the potential dangers of going and focusing on things that are hot topics of the moment, as opposed to really thinking about, okay, so what's the real issue in terms of procurement? And I would argue the real issue is we don't have enough countries who have actually joined into these types of agreements and in the process improve their regulatory environment for procurement. The way forward, there's a lot of focus on intergovernmental discussion. I think that's my final point on this paper, is obviously that's needed. But what I was kind of missing is, where's the private sector in this? Right. So again, it goes back to who are the beneficiaries, who are paying, who's paying the costs of these different types of policy areas. And I think there's a lot of information embedded, obviously, in the private sector, which governments are not using. And for me, the whole COVID experience is another illustration of governments often simply not understanding how these things work, right? But also solving that particular problem of enhancing supply of vaccines, for example, or PPE or whatever it is, requires actually understanding how these things are produced and where are the constraints, where are the frictions, where can we actually do something to boost supply. And you don't get that out of intergovernmental discussion. And I think the same thing applies to a lot of these topics. So I would argue, again, in terms of giving advice to governments, start thinking more about how do you actually make the private sector a partner. What are the mechanisms through which you can actually think about doing that, taking into account, of course, concerns about regulatory capture, etc. But I think that's something that I think deserves more discussion. Then one really mini point on this paper, I would get rid of the first sentence in the executive summary. Right, all of that is going to do is create problems for you, and you really don't need it. So turning to Simon. This is, of course, absolutely spectacular work, right? And I'm sure it's been a huge amount of work to put this all together. I think it's really informative. It's nice that it's balanced, right? So the bottom line message is we're all sinners. We kind of knew that, but you've actually put numbers on it. So independent of what we think about kind of the political environment, or independent of what we think about what countries are trying to do and what the effects of that are. I mean, what is really valuable here, these are just facts. Right now, we can undoubtedly, the countries that are being dissected here might have things to say about those facts, but I think putting them out there is exactly what we need to do, so that insofar as countries say this is not really an issue, let them make that case. So I think that it's all really valuable. I can't disagree with any of the recommendations, because I've been writing pretty much the same thing. So even if it was just a matter of coherence, I have to say, obviously I agree with all of this. I think the big question in terms of the recommendations, in terms of doing, moving forward and having these discussions, deliberations, the big question that you don't get into is who's going to do this, right? Who's going to do it? Where is it going to be done? How does it get done? How does it get financed? And I think that's something maybe we can collectively discuss, think about, because I think it's a real issue, right? It's not going to get done in the WTO, certainly not in the current environment. There's going to be a lot of opposition to saying, okay, let's have the OECD do it because the OECD has a lot of expertise in this area, has a track record, but precisely because it's not a multilateral institution, because it has limited membership. So therefore it has less legitimacy in the eyes of many and so forth. So should it be a joint venture of international organizations? Well, my understanding is the international organizations are working on a report. And I think one of the nice little experiments we're going to be able to do in the next couple of weeks is compare what you've done to what they come up with. I'm really looking forward to that. But I think there's a lot of antibodies, obviously, among I used to work for an international organization, so I can say this, about working together, right? Everybody has its own mandate, they have their own incentives. So if we're going to ask the international organizations to do and to pursue this kind of deliberation, inform the deliberation, do the analysis, we need some really serious, heavy top-down political instructions, right? And the question is, are we going to see that happening? I doubt it. But anyway, I think I don't really have an answer to this question. I mean, Simon and I have gone around this bush a number of times. It might actually be most efficient to have independent agencies, entities do this, right? So the GTAs of the world teaming up with academics, research institutions. So, you know, that's one model. Obviously, the challenge to that is financing and incentives for the people you would want to do that work, right? It's hard to publish, incentives therefore are low. So anyway, all I'm doing is putting this on the table. I think it's a real issue in terms of moving this agenda forward. Unfortunately, I don't have a magic bullet, but we have lots of very smart people on this call, so maybe we can solve that puzzle later in the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Bernard. And I think we'll come back to the issue of kind of who does what. I suppose I pick up on a couple of things. I think it's very interesting to highlight the private sector. One of the things that we did on working industrials was work from what firms receive rather than what governments give. So we started firm up looking at particular value chains. And that's a very resource intensive way to do it because you spend the first 3 months understanding how the value chain works. And then after that, seeing what you get. But you do pick up different kinds of instruments when you're looking at what firms get rather than what governments give. But look, let me move now to our final discussant. And let me welcome Yeling Tan, who is the Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Oregon. So Yeling, over to you.
Thanks very much, Julian. Thanks for the invitation to participate in this conversation. I just have 3 main points for discussion here. The first is on transparency, the second on good versus bad subsidies, and the third will be on further research that's needed. So starting with the issue of transparency, both papers and several of our speakers today have emphasized the need for greater transparency, and I absolutely agree that this should be a priority. And the challenge can be seen even in existing data collection efforts. Simon's paper, I thought, did a really fantastic job in laying out both the conceptual and measurement issues and thinking about subsidies. So I really applaud the initiative. But as that paper itself acknowledges, the China data collected on the subsidy front is almost certainly a lower bound. So there are 2 layers of challenges here. The first is that there is a need for greater disclosure from all parties at the moment, given weak practices of notification to the WTO. But the second layer is that there's also an added challenge in collecting data across regimes from regimes with different transparency norms. So I think we all agree that transparency is an important priority. The question I want to put forward for discussion is how exactly transparency and disclosure can be improved, and how do we think through the design principles? How do we shift incentives towards proactive disclosure? And what are the potential barriers to implementation? So drawing on some research domestically within China, the central government has had trouble with strengthening its disclosure practices for a long time. And this is despite a genuine effort to boost policy transparency following its entry into the WTO in 2001, putting forward national disclosure regulations over 10 years ago. My own research on environmental transparency in China found tremendous implementation challenges, particularly at the subnational level. And this is something that Simon just mentioned earlier is very much needed, more data from the subnational level. What I found was that it was the most polluting cities in China that were the least likely to adopt national environmental transparency regulations. And what that means is that disclosure efforts were failing in precisely those locations where they needed to have the greatest impact. In the end, at least on the environmental front, relying on regular government processes to boost transparency was insufficient. So pressure through the multinational supply chain was actually one alternative channel through which incentives for local governments could be shifted to bring them more, to make them more proactive in disclosing information. So I hope to have a broader discussion on these questions of how we design the rules if we want to improve transparency and disclosure, which we all agree is a strong priority. Governmental channels are important, but let's also consider non-governmental channels of reporting, the private sector, as Bernard and Julia just mentioned, how to raise incentives to disclose, what are the systems of verification that we need to think about. An added layer of concern I would like to point out is that even with greater transparency over issues such as subsidies, that might simply drive distortionary behavior towards other non-tariff barriers. Exchange rates, which have not been discussed in either of the papers, technical standards, and so on. There's simply such a wide range of options at the disposal of governments that we need to think through the final impact versus the shifting towards less transparent options. So here, research from political scientists such as Daniel Kono have looked at this issue of what he calls optimal obfuscation in developed democracies, where the reduction of transparent barriers such as tariffs were eventually accompanied by an increase in opaque non-tariff barriers. Ongoing research that I'm doing with Christina Davis at Harvard on SOE trade finds that there's been a bifurcated impact on the trading behavior of SOEs after China joined the WTO. On the one hand, SOE trade in non-strategic products does display a stronger profit orientation. On the other hand, we don't see this liberalizing effect on trade in strategic goods. So again, we see this shifting towards less transparent behavior. So SOE import purchases end up becoming another government tool to shield import competing firms in strategic sectors. So how can we think about greater transparency on the one hand, bringing, expanding the amount of information that we have and potentially contributing a lot of broader efficiency in figuring out where the distortions are. On the other hand, is distortionary behavior simply moving towards more hidden avenues. On good versus bad subsidies, this is again something that was discussed in both papers. I want to raise some questions about how we measure harm versus benefit. A very clear and therefore advantageous approach, but a more narrow approach, is to assess harm inflicted on trade partners strictly in terms of the impact on competing firms in a given product group. But harm and impact assessment becomes more complicated when one takes into account supply chain and downstream impacts into consideration. So if we just take the climate change challenge and look at solar panels as an example, it's clearly a global commons problem. So private costs are not capturing social costs, which at least at the economic front creates a justification for subsidies to create a more socially optimal level of production, not just for a given nation, but at the global level. But how do we assess harm versus benefit? Solar panel subsidies to producers in country A might hurt solar panel producers in country B, but these imports of cheap panels also create jobs for solar panel installation firms in country B and cheaper panels for households in country B, not to mention broader societal gains at the environmental front. So Although the actual benefit and harm analysis is extremely tricky to navigate, as I'm sure everyone is already cognizant of, I still think it's important to emphasize because it's an important challenge to confront if we want to make real gains in distinguishing between good subsidies and bad subsidies. Another thing I want to raise on this issue is that even if there is a case for good subsidies, there are still additional concerns to take into account. So for example, when a subsidy race is triggered, can subsidies that are nominally good nevertheless create harm? And here I wonder if we can draw on research and industrial policy to come up with principles to align what are essentially twin goals: social optimality on the one hand and competitiveness on the other. Here, I wonder if we can examine research on how governments in East Asia were able to successfully withdraw support from infant industry firms by combining subsidies with clear guidelines for conditions under which the support would eventually be withdrawn, such that firms that were receiving the subsidies had an incentive to become more competitive. And finally, should there be considerations for supply chain resilience, such that it's not socially optimal for the production of environmental goods to be disproportionately reliant on certain regions? The pandemic has made us all more aware of these issues of supply chain resilience. Can we bring this angle of consideration into the discussion of what is socially optimal, what is a good subsidy, what is a bad subsidy? And finally, just really quickly on research, I support the recommendation made in both papers that there should be more concerted studies, and I definitely second Bernard's comments on the need for more analysis. More research needs to be done, developing an analysis on what optimal subsidy instruments might be, what are some key principles for subsidy design that we could all agree on. For example, and let's think through different scenarios. I thought there was a great suggestion in Simon's paper on subsidizing purchasers, buyers instead of producers, but there might be limits to such a demand-driven approach. What if there are economies of scale barriers to production? So economic analysis would suggest that a production subsidy is nevertheless needed here. So I think it's just quite clear that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done on this front. So one of the key recommendations should be to channel more energy into greater analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I think that was lots of food for thought there on some of the most important questions. I think very interesting on just how hard it is to get the incentives for transparency right. You know, as anyone who's ever worked on integrity and corruption issues knows, that the people who are actually declaring their problems often look like they're more corrupt. So especially when we're counting measures, if you only notify one big one, you're better off than if you notify independently. But I think also too your discussion on good and bad subsidies is coming to one of the really crunch issues that we face. Do we look at objectives, especially as we know that the green challenge, the digital transformation, supply chain resilience, and even in some cases, people argue national security are all the new reasons governments are giving for government support. But what do we know about the impact of that? And is it dangerous to declare something good in advance? Those who are familiar with the Agreement on Agriculture may have a view on that. So we now have about 40 minutes for discussion. I would see if there's turn over to the floor and see if there are requests. And I've already got one. So Alejandra Hara, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Julia, and congratulations to both presentations, the papers, and the comments. Really spectacular data. And I'd like to make in this regard 3 comments. One about the transparency gap. I will submit to you that perhaps it's hopeless. You will, I think, never get the kind of transparency that you really need through the intergovernmental process, no matter how you write the rules and so on and so forth. Even if countries notify, they will always be regarded with some degree of suspicion and so on and so forth. And what Simon and Johannes Fritz have done, I think it shows that perhaps you don't need governments to notify in order to know what's happening out there. So secretariats, they are doing something already. We have been promised a paper by agencies cooperating, including WTO, by the end of the year, probably. So we're waiting to see what that brings us. But I think that a lot can be done by GTA and so on and so forth, and I'll have something more to say on that. I think that proves the point that, for example, an active secretariat that collects information, organizes information, doesn't really, one, need to ask governments about it, and secondly, they can provide a good public service, public good, in order to provide that information in such a way that one, members can use it, and secondly, that levels the playing field in terms of access for information, particularly for countries with weaker resources. My second comment is about the Government Procurement Agency. This is a minor but not unimportant point, because both in the presentation and the comment of Bernard, the point was made about the membership. Why hasn't it really expanded? And I would submit to you that it has expanded, but maybe in ways with which you're unseen. There are countries that have very extensive network of free trade agreements, and most, if not all, of those free trade agreements have government procurement chapters. One is the case of my country, Chile. And why when we did sign on to the GPA? Because our domestic law, which does not discriminate on government procurement, is much better. And we didn't want to be exposed to trying to implement an international treaty which would weaken our laws and regulations in this matter with higher thresholds, etc. For example, Mexico also has an extensive network of free trade agreements. And many of those agreements, if not all, the Mexican ambassadors present have government procurement chapters. Why didn't Mexico sign? Well, I'll let the Mexican ambassador answer to that. I think I know the answer, but it doesn't really matter. And so on and so forth. So there are other countries like Peru and others who have incorporated through treaties, bilateral or regional groupings, government procurement. So the network here is much more extensive that meets the eye, but just by looking at the membership of the GPA. So maybe the GPA is not all that ideal in the eyes of some countries, and perhaps presents a particular problem, etc. But the fact is that I think the ones who have government procurement national treatment is far more than what the members of the GPA show. And finally, Bernard's question, who's going to do it and how it's going to be financed? I think this merits a lot of more thinking. The question is very pertinent, but one important thing is to get the methodology validated and to get it can be shared with others so that maybe they can also, and I'm going to return to that in a second, they can also undertake studies such as global trade alerts. I'm thinking, for example, of regional development banks who can do a lot, or institutions such as the Economic Mission Latin America, ECLEC, or think tanks or universities might be interested in taking national or subnational studies of this. But the important thing to begin with is that to use the same methodology. So when you get the numbers in, they can be compared across the board. And I think that would be a first step in order to get others to supplement and complement this fabulous exercise that has been presented to us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro. And can I ask if any of the speakers or discussants would like to respond to either Alejandro or anything they've heard so far? Jean?
Oh, yes. 2 points, I think you're raising a really important point about the fact that the GPA has had a much broader influence than the numbers of membership show, because as you point out, many countries in their RTAs, their regional trade agreements, have procurement chapters, and they're often based upon the GPA rules. But they also, they're not joining the GPA. And I thought your point about why Chile has not joined the GPA is a very interesting one, that would basically have to lower its standards, if you will, to meet the GPA requirements, even though I think Chile has RTAs with almost all the GPA parties. But I think there's also 2 other reasons that I think we need to look at. One is that most GPA parties allow anyone to participate in the procurement that they cover under the GPA. They only have obligations to allow their other GPA parties to participate. But in fact, it's basically a free rider situation where anyone can participate. The US is an exception because it has a prohibition against purchasing from non-RTA or non-GPA parties. But there's obviously a lot of exceptions to that as well. And then I think the second reason is that there's just not clear evidence that GPA parties are buying from one another. The Secretariat has estimated that about $1.7 trillion of procurement is covered under the GPA, but there's just no strong evidence that that's led to a lot of new market or a lot of contracts among the parties. And so I think there's a question of why should I bother if it's not clear that there's going to be sort of some actual dollars coming into my country from joining the GPA. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. And let me turn to my co-host for a question. Do you have the floor?
Yeah, thank you, Julia. No, I just have a quick comment and a question. The comment is very much on something I think I noticed from Kamala's report is about why focusing on industrial subsidies. Actually, we also intend to look at kind of more holistically about the whole WTO structure, covering different subsidies, including that on agriculture, and which, of course, as the report itself said, and many others have said repeatedly, that you cannot focus on one subsidy while putting aside what to do about the other subsidies. And I think that's also a kind of balance of interest for any kind of politicians to sell any kind of new disciplines on whatever subsidies back at home. So I think that's a very key issue. I think it would be good if we could also see how we can do that, especially when Simon said that we need a period of reflection after MC12 and looking really at industrial subsidies. So my immediate thought would be that, okay, could we do a kind of more holistic policy dialogue instead of kind of a silo dialogue on different subsidies? So that's the first one. The second one is more a kind of question about, because we discussed a lot here about subsidies not only done by federal, but more by sub-federal system. I mean, if we take the big 3 guys together, and we notice from Simon's report is that actually that a lot of has been done in China by what we call provinces, and then in the EU by the member states, and in the US, of course, by different states. So my question would be that if we really want to tackle that, I mean, I'm not an expert on the legal system of each and every country, but as a Chinese and a former Chinese official, my thought would be that legally speaking, probably it would be easier for China to do it. When I left the government, actually, China Ministry of Commerce did establish a branch, a section to check the conformity of new measures by provincial or even sub-provincial governments, anything subsidies or any new rules of standards or whatever, to see whether they conform to the WTO rules. So there's some action there. But I want in the EU, the Commission vis-a-vis the member states, and then the US federal government vis-a-vis the states, legally speaking, how easy would it be for them to really go down to the lower level and get this done. So that's my question to any of the panelists could answer that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn to the panelists to answer that question, those two questions, because I think they're important. I'm going to add a question to the first one. I think it's very important that we have a holistic and balanced debate on this. One of the things that strikes me, though, is we actually know quite a lot about agriculture. We know quite a lot about who gives what. We know quite a lot about what's market distorting or not. And we know it in really some detail and some transparency, and we've known it for some years. But it's really hard to do anything about it. So what is the lessons from agriculture, and are we going to be able to move it? You know, is this time different? Can I first, who wants to go first on the panel? Or I'm going to pick on somebody. I'm going to go for you. So I'm going to do Kamala and then followed by Simon. Thanks.
I can't respond directly to your question regarding agriculture and subsidies, because clearly there's an impasse that's very much about the political economy. One thing I thought was very interesting that we weren't able to kind of really bring out into the paper, partly because it was too analytical for the audience that we want to touch, but also partly because it sets off a kind of like a little bomb, is Sykes's piece on the questionable case for subsidy regulation. Now, it's a really interesting piece because he says there are so many, as you pointed out, Julia, there are so many ways that governments can distort an economy in their favor. And there's a policy substitution problem. You regulate one area, it goes into another. And so he actually says, let's talk about this. You know, what are we trying to do with subsidy regulation when we accept that some subsidies are important and necessary, and yet we cannot in any way regulate this sort of like anarchy of policy instruments that can distort an economy. And I think I would like to revisit his discussion on that, because it really does highlight the real problem that we're facing. Is like, well, you know, it's firefighting. You put out one fire, another one starts. You put out that fire, another one starts. And as you change the mindset of governments towards the fact that the plan A is that we cooperate and coordinate and we assess this on a global level, it's very difficult to see how there would be a clear solution. Because as you said, Julia, how creative are we in bending the rules or finding loopholes?
Simon, over to you.
Yes, if I may. So let's start with the subnational government. If you go to the US, I mean, there's only one aspect of US law where the federal government limits in any way the tax breaks which are offered by cities and states in the United States, and that has to do with the revenue development bonds. In every other area of tax breaks, it's as Alan Sykes refers to it, he calls it the Wild West, and it is. So the US has a system where there is very little constraint at the subnational level, other than that imposed by the voters, if that is any discipline at all. The other important thing about the US is that many of the states and the cities are not in compliance with the Government Accounting Standards Board standards on reporting tax breaks. And so there is a significant transparency problem there, or at least compliance problem on the US side. With respect to the European Union, compliance is probably better, but having gone through now thousands of the submissions over the years to the EU, even there, I mean, there are many incomplete submissions, and areas where essentially, well, it would be fair to say that there has not been a wholehearted attempt at compliance with the obligations, and it's not clear that how far the Commission's been prepared to go from that. And you saw recently that the Commission is further extending the relaxation of the rules that they have on state aid. So the pressure there, I think, is perhaps in the wrong direction. Let me make one other comment, and it was raised first by Yeling and then by Lou, and this is the whack-a-mole problem, which is that this is as it's called, I think, in the US, and certainly where I first learned it, and that is that once we're successful at whacking one type of trade distortion, another one pops up somewhere else. That may be true, but I still think we should be whacking the moles. And I think so that's point one. Point two is I'm very nervous when people say that they want to broaden the discussion to include all sorts of trade, all sorts of policy interventions, because I suspect a discussion on everything will very quickly become a discussion about nothing. I think the area of subsidies is sufficiently broad that it implicates enough countries and enough commercial interests that one could get a conversation going. And what I particularly like about subsidy reform is that it has a different political economy. We are, coming out of a pandemic where lots of governments' public finances are in dire straits. There will be finance ministries looking for areas to cut in the next few years, and the finance ministries should, may well be allies in terms of trying to sort of rethink and rationalize subsidy policy. Again, not eliminate subsidies, just rationalizing it. And that's why I think if one does have this type of dialogue, it needs to involve people not just from trade ministries. It should involve economics ministries and finance ministries as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Heilman. I certainly agree with those. Can I follow up to both of you though, perhaps with the question? So when we're talking about this dialogue and we're talking about this analysis, why hasn't this worked so far in subsidies in agriculture? Is it that we need lots of different subsidy sectors on the table all the time? Because a lot of the process that we're talking about, the analysis, the understanding, the transparency, we've got a lot of that. So what else do we need? Back to you, Simon, on that one, maybe.
I think in the area of agriculture, maybe the problem is that it's in most countries is too small a part of the economy, and it's the gains are so concentrated in a group who are determined to keep them. And I think the issue is the political economy there is broken down precisely because it's very hard to see what you're balancing off against what's the payoff for all the pain, unless you have some fiscal policy shock which requires retrenchment in government spending across the board. So I think, the agriculture is great in terms of the data collection, the analysis, but just because we got stuck there doesn't mean that we'll get stuck everywhere.
So how
can I also, let me also come in.
Yeah. Maybe Kamala and then Bernard.
I just wanted to follow up on something that Jean said. Like, we know the public procurement agreement is a holistic agreement in the sense that it tackles governance as well as trade, market access. Now, in the work that I've done in trying to kind of like sort of advocate the expansion of the GPA to developing countries, the first obstacle we come up against is that they don't have export interests that can be satisfied by the government procurement agreement. Even on a regional level, they're all doing the same sort of thing. They haven't sorted out kind of diversification of supply chains there. So it's very hard to sell the good governance on its own, because you don't need the GPA for good governance. If you have the political will, and what we're talking about here is political will across the board. If you have the political will to have good governance in your public procurement agreement, there'll be a huge lobby that says, well, we haven't got export market opportunities here, so we can do the good governance thing on our own. Let's get UNCTAD or UNCITRAL or one of the other agreements or guidelines and look at that. So, when you're talking about trying to sell something that has a huge impact on a developing country's sovereignty and policy space, you have to give an incentive for them to trade that away. And the GPA doesn't seem to do that for the smaller developing countries. And the expansion that has occurred under the GPA, not in regional trade agreements, has been very much linked to accession protocols. And there, the incentive to join is very different from if you join because you wholeheartedly think this is a great idea. So I think we have to think about, more about the political economy of this and how, from a policy perspective, of course, we can see some of these things are no-brainers. But actually, when you're dealing with lobbies and democracies and fragile institutions, it's a very different kettle of fish, especially if you don't have developed industry domestically.
I think while we have two different issues in some ways with government procurement and government support, we have a similar problem in terms of this issue about incentives and interests. Bernard, over to you.
Yeah, just a few reactions to the discussion so far. So one on the government procurement agenda. Clearly, we do have preferential trade agreements. We have this embedded in lots of agreements. I would say much more important is the work that the international organizations have done to try and improve procurement regimes in lots of countries. So that's there. Right. I think the point I was making is that it's still the case that most governments, when they think about industrial policy, they think procurement, right? So partly that's because lots of governments don't have access to the fiscal space to subsidize as much as they would like to do. So I think that was my main point, is we need to drill down a bit more on, okay, how can you actually do that efficiently, effectively, as opposed to saying it's an SOE problem. Maybe that was my main point on that one. I want to come back to Alejandro's point on methodology, because he says, start, all use the same methodology. I say we need to go back a step further. I mean, we need to agree on what the methodologies might be. And I think methodology is plural. We're never going to have just one methodology approach. And I think that's where I would start to try to get a handle on this. I also agree with Simon, we need to keep it specific. Because if you have this discussion with a macro economist, with somebody who is working on international exchange rates, the first thing they're going to say, you guys are completely missing the picture, because the way we should be thinking about this is how is this reflected in exchange rates, right? In terms of competitiveness, in terms of the big picture story, which you're missing completely, because you trade people are constantly digging into too much detail. So move it up a level and actually look at competitiveness the way we think about competitiveness. And I think that gets you into this whole problem of, so how do you actually do general equilibrium in a way that it's operational? And, we've talked about this in different ways, and it's very hard to do. So I think it goes back to my point of we need to do more to actually identify at a sector level, where are the big distortions? Where are the big problems? Independent of what the types of mechanisms might be. And I think that may be one way. And that's, I think, where the private sector comes in, where we need to do more to talk to competition authorities in terms of thinking about, how do you kind of identify competitive distortions on markets? I think on the agriculture question, I think here the stylized fact is we had the US and the EU, right? So we had one major agricultural exporter really irritated at the European Union turning from a net importer into a net exporter. And that what drove a lot of that, the political economy dynamics. Plus, of course, ministers of finance in Europe saying, why the hell are we spending and wasting so much money on a bunch of what ultimately are rich people, right? So I think also there was an internal political economy there of educating people to say, okay, you might pretend that this is all going to smallholder farmers and small farms, but in fact, that's not the case, right? So I think it's that admissive thing. Let me be a bit facetious and say, well, maybe the answer is that a lot of this discussion we're having about subsidies simply doesn't irritate enough powerful interests to say we need to deal with this, right? Now, one way of packaging that argument says the glass house syndrome, we're all doing it, so therefore we don't want to kind of deal with this. But it might also very well be that at the end of the day, maybe it's not that important overall. And I think that goes back to the point, we really need to have a much more credible case, I would argue, of identifying where things are actually making a big impact in terms of competitive distortions globally, because otherwise we're kind of talking in circles. So I think the type of work the OECD did, is something that is really valuable. And I think we need to do a lot more of that. Now, yes, it's difficult. Like Julia said, it takes you 3 months to figure out how these things work, but that's what we should do.
Thanks, Bernard. Can I ask a question then to all the actually I have Hector Torres who wants to come in, and then I'll come in with my question afterwards. Hector, over to you. I see you've been in the chat on your question about instruments, so over to you, Hector.
Yes, thank you, Julia, and thank you everybody for those very interesting papers and presentations. Well, my question is very much related to what I wrote in the chat. We are naturally, when we think about subsidies, we think about fiscal policies, meaning something that comes from the government's budget, and that could be transparent because of that. But since the crisis, the Lehman Brothers crisis, and now even more with the COVID crisis, monetary authorities have been very, very active.
in creating quasi-fiscal support, not just for, as they use, monetary authorities normally use to work with, they target inflation, they work with interest rates, long-term interest rates mostly, but now they have been purchasing assets by expanding the monetary base. And to a point in which the Fed has tripled the monetary base, it's more or less the same, the ECB. The People's Bank of China, much less. But of course, countries that do not issue international reserve currencies have much less demand for their currency, so they cannot do it without kindling inflation. And now, of course, we have a problem of inflation even in reserve issuing countries. But the point is that these central bankers have been buying bonds issued by the government, but also corporate bonds, even corporate equity. And of course, lowering interest rates for the government and for corporations. This has a clear economic effect. I mean, they don't do it innocently. They're trying to boost the private sector to keep up the economy despite the COVID. And it's not an ideological criticism. It's just noting that the borderline between what we used to consider fiscal policies and monetary policies is totally blurred. And if we do not, I wonder, this is an honest question, I think that if we do not look at this in some way, at least we have to be conscious about this existence, the discussion will be very unbalanced, because all the countries that cannot issue international reserve currencies have to provide support or want to match the support that other countries are providing to their, let's say, national enterprises, to call them somehow. And this is massive. It's not just a small amount of money. So my question is, of course, it's difficult to find a good fit for quasi-monetary policies used to support the fiscal authority and even private corporate within the very narrow definition of the WTO. But this doesn't mean that it's not a subsidy. OECD uses a definition of subsidy for agriculture that doesn't match WTO. And we have to be frank about this. So I want to throw this and see if you thought about that and if something could be done.
And Hector, I'm going to collect, given that we don't have much time left, I'm going to collect a couple of questions. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to direct a question to Simon, and regarding your paper with Johannes. Obviously, I don't need to reiterate what everybody has said about the opus. It's really an amazing set of data. And I really am thinking in the kind of economist versus lawyer conversation about the data. You mentioned the definition that you used was the kind of competition state aid definition, which is not the definition in the subsidies agreement. And you do welcome in your kind of notes the addition of observations and clarifications on the kind of legal characterization of the subsidies. But I have a question about why did you take that approach for the WTO context, leaving it to everyone else to sort out what the good and the bad are if the agreement on subsidies defines what members thought was good and bad as far as prohibited and not prohibited or specific and not specific? How do we make that first cut through your data if we want to have a debate about the subsidies relevant to the WTO definition itself? Oh, I'm sorry. And one small question. Can you just say a word about services subsidies, which you kind of mentioned in your report, but you were mentioning here industrial subsidies, specifically services subsidies as inputs to industrial exports? Thanks.
So Simon, can you perhaps answer those ones from Daniel, and also if you want to touch on those from Hector, and if others wanted to, and then I'll come back with one final question for you all.
Yeah, I'll try and do that. And thank you for these questions. So I'll start with Hector. I have a lot of sympathy with part of what Hector says. I'm not sure that a discussion about corporate subsidies is much helped by tracking central bank governments' purchases of government bonds. I am sympathetic to the argument that we should be tracking central banks' direct lending to companies. And a great example is what the Bank of England does in this respect. And that information is publicly available. I would also be very interested in central bank acquisition of equity stakes as well, because that too could be important as well, and of purchase of bonds. But in those cases, actually much harder to document. I've tried to find this in the context of, say, the European Central Bank and not been that successful. So I have, there's a part of where Hector was going, I would be very sympathetic to, because these are state transfers of resources. Now, with respect to Daniel's first point, although I said that we took a largely competition state law, state aid approach, in fact, the 4 characteristics of subsidies that we emphasize in Chapter 3 of the report are the 4 characteristics which are emphasized in the WTO agreement as well. So there's a hell of a lot of overlap in the approach, and that was deliberately chosen. And I made sure that someone who knows much more about the WTO's subsidy code reviewed this before we published it. So I think there is more overlap there. Where I have some sympathy with what he has to say is that, I think the interesting question is going to be, how can you take our subsidy inventory and what additional filters do you want to add to it? Okay, I think that's very important. I think it would be fair to say that every one of the subsidies in our inventory involves a potential or actual transfer of resources, state resources. It certainly involves measures which confer advantages on firms and measures which are selective in some meaningful respect. So I think that pretty much gets you largely where we need to be as far as the WTO is concerned, but you're the lawyer, not me. But I would be really open for a conversation about what additional filters we could apply so we could find out on the existing rules which of the subsidies are more egregious or more of a source of concern. So I guess there's work to be done there. On the service sector subsidies, there's, this is the presentation that Bernard and I were just at. There are quite a number, there's a wide diverse range of forms of subsidies. We have a range of financial grants, loan guarantees, state loans, and even overseas financial expansion of businesses being financed by states as well. And so that's the range of subsidies we see in the service sector. It's quite substantial, to be honest, in terms of numbers in the inventory, much more than, quite frankly, I had expected when we started this project. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to ask all the speakers in the reverse order to maybe answer one final question just to finish us. So beginning with you, Yeling. So we've all stressed today the importance of transparency. So how would you incentivize transparency, either by firms and governments doing it themselves or to pay somebody else to do it for them? How would you incentivize the sort of transparency we're all calling for? Yeling, I'll start with you.
Thanks very much. It's a great question. And I think there basically needs to be a multi-pronged approach for the government authorities who might be more reluctant to proactively disclose their information. I think we need to look at ways in which to change their incentive structure. And that largely should come from the private and non-public space. So I think we can think of definitely how the links between the private sector and the government and how to leverage on that relationship to motivate subnational governments, for example, to become more proactive. We haven't talked much about the NGO space and civil society, but certainly in various countries around the world, they do play an important role in exerting more pressure on local governments to be more transparent. And then aside from that, I absolutely support independent efforts to just collect more data. I think that hidden data is becoming more and more easy to uncover, in part because of technological tools that we have today that were simply not available in previous years. So I think multi-pronged, absolutely.
Thanks, and Bernard, to you. And then I'll go to Simon and then Jane.
I think it really needs to focus in terms of incentives. I think it's a mix. It's multidimensional in a sense, but I think the common denominator of incentivizing more work on this is to really make it clear to those who have an interest, whether those are ministers of finance, whether those are stakeholder groups, that it's in our own interest. Forget about the WTO, forget about spillovers. Just think about what are we doing nationally, right? So we're doing a whole bunch of stuff and we need to ensure that we're actually having an impact, right? Is what we're doing effective, right? So we all have whatever the political objectives are or in a particular context. Is what we're doing what we want it to do, right? And that's something that in principle, everybody should have an interest in doing, but to get an answer to that question, we need to actually know what we are doing. So I would start with that. So I've always thought this whole emphasis on notifications, you need to notify so that your trading partners know what you're doing, is really getting the cart backwards. And Bob Wolf has a number of papers on this where he makes this point very eloquently. You know, it's in your own interest. So you need to be able to do this for yourself. And then maybe the international community can help. Maybe trade agreements and rules can help. But ultimately, it's really in your own interest to know what you're doing. Because otherwise, how can you learn? And how do you know what you're doing is actually useful? Also for politicians who can then credibly claim, we're actually doing something useful for you guys. Here's what we've done, right? It's not all negative. I mean, this really should be a positive agenda.
And so Simon and then Jane.
Let me just quickly endorse what Bernard said. I mean, and just add one further twist to this. I mean, if you want an era or a time when you're going to get the attention of finance ministers, it's going to be now when they're trying to sort out public finances. So I really think the iron is hot. We should strike, and there should be much more of an alliance here between the more progressive trade ministers and the more penny pinching finance ministers. Thanks for organising the session too.
Jane and then Kamala.
Thank you. Well, I would also echo Bernard's comments, but on the procurement side, I think one of the important points would be if you strip out market access obligations and are saying you don't have to open up your procurement, just make it more transparent. I think there's many arguments for having a common set of rules, and it would not be a heavy lift for most countries, but it would unify all the countries under one umbrella to have common rules that were multilateral, as opposed to this one agreement that just applies to a few members. Thank you, and thanks for including me in this discussion.
Kamala.
Yeah, I echo what's been said. Just one more thing, really. There a lot of evidence is already out, exists, but governments aren't giving it up. So I know in my area of export credit, there's a load going on that I'm not able to get access to, freedom of information, replies don't come back to me, business confidentiality, Germany particularly, puts a whole seal on a whole load of government data. So it's also about saying, well, you know, you've got the data there, give it to us because this is a democratic situation and we want good policy making based on evidence. And I really think that if we had the information available to us, it's already there, it would be a good start.
Thanks very much. Look, I can only endorse the panel. I think my own sense of working in this field is that very often the two questions that matter about subsidies, who pays and who benefits, the answers are usually not what people think they are. And often they're sold on a very different basis. So I think that the more work that we can all do to answer those two questions and to have that as part of a domestic debate, but also a global debate, it's easier to stare down your scary lobbies when everybody else is. And it's easier to prevent tomorrow's moles in tomorrow's sectors when you're all working together to do so. Look, all I can do as the moderator is to thank very much all our excellent speakers and to thank our audience for a very stimulating debate. And I give you a round of applause, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Julia. And thanks to, of course, to the whole panel, everyone. It's such a great discussion here. And personally, I like, in particular, the final point on the finance minister, because as a former trade official, I know how the tricks are with the trade officials and others, and especially also agriculture and others who demands a lot of subsidies. So I think that's probably the way to go, at least partially. Of course, I mean, I just also want to thank our partner for this event, the World Economic Forum, in particular, Sean and Aditi, who has helped us to put everything together and to make this happen. And we, of course, look forward to seeing you again and for our next events. We still have two more to go before the EMS12. So one on appellate body, another heavy topic, and another one on the GSI of investment facilitation. So and after that, we will all quietly go into the EMS12. And after that, of course, we will help try to organize more. So thanks a lot again to everyone and the participants also. And we look forward to seeing you in the future for FMG activities. So bye-bye, thanks.